from KimKnightHealth.com, and today my topic is your mother in the NPD squad? And I'm going to share in a moment what that means. Now, before I go on, I always say at the start of my webinars that I don't diagnose, cure, heal, or treat anybody. And if you need medical advice, please seek the appropriate assistance. So, NPD, of course, a play on NYPD, Narcissistic Personality Disorder. Now, what I'm going to cover in this webinar is 10 signs that you may be the daughter or the son of a narcissistic mother. And this is a topic that is very dear to my heart because it's something that I've had to go through and I'm continuing to heal from myself. And it has serious impacts on our health and well-being. And this is why it is so important to recognize it and know what to do. So why am I sharing this? Well, firstly, what I've discovered and observed is that often when we grow up with a mean or cruel or abusive or narcissistic parent, and today I'm mainly focusing on the mother, but it could be either parent. When we grow up in this environment, we don't recognize what's going on. We don't understand it. We don't understand that it's not normal because it's normal for us. But just because it's normal for us doesn't make it natural and doesn't make it right. And so it can take it can take quite a lot to recognize when it's going on or when it has gone on in the past. So I am working with people all the time who have had abusive, cruel childhoods. And until we speak, often they have not fully recognized, they may have partly recognized but not fully recognized the extent of the abuse and therefore the ramifications of that experience. Because what happens is, and I've seen this in 100% of the clients that I work with, it's just the type of client that I tend to work with, 100% when we track back the reason that they're ill now, and I'm talking serious illnesses like chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, serious health conditions, some of them not even diagnosable, but the symptoms are there. When we track back, we find that the reason that they have the illness now and the symptoms now is because they've not healed the pain, the emotional scars of the past, which means that pain is still sitting inside of them, and also they have certain behaviors and habits which are perpetuating the problem. So yes, I'm sharing this because often we don't recognize the signs and the symptoms of growing up with a narcissistic mother. And often what most people will do, this is very, very common, is that we will minimalize and downplay and rationalize away the behavior of the parent. And this is because as little children, as infants, we rely on our parents to literally keep us alive. So we can't make our parents wrong. And so what happens is, instead of making them wrong, we make ourselves wrong. And then we create very low self-esteem, low self-value, low self-belief, low self-worth. I'm bad, I'm not good enough. But all of that is running in the unconscious psyche. We may see the tip of the iceberg of it, but often we don't see what's underneath the water, which is 90% of the iceberg. Because 90% of our mind, or even more, some say 97% of our mind, is in the unconscious. So hopefully through doing this webinar, you may come to understand some of the signs and the traits that maybe you grew up in an abusive or narcissistic environment and you haven't yet fully recognized it, but maybe some of what I'll share today will help you to recognize it. Also, as I've already mentioned just before, when we have this deep trauma inside of us from living in an environment where we're constantly on eggshells, we're afraid of our parents, we're being punished, we're being criticized, we're being judged, maybe abused physically, mentally, psychologically, even sometimes sexually, then this trauma will lead to deep unhappiness and illness unless it is cleared. It's just what's going to happen. And the first step in healing, whether it's becoming happier or whether it's clearing illness and symptoms, is becoming aware of the problem. Just understanding and seeing without filters and without judgment and without minimalizing the truth of the reality of the situation. And this is what we don't see when we're growing up. And I remember, for example, when I was about 13 years old, and I remember I was walking to school one day and I bumped into a friend, and she was telling me something about her mother. I can't remember what it was, but I remember thinking to myself, wow, really? Does your mother treat you like that? And she'd said something nice, you know, her mother had done something nice, and I was absolutely gobsmacked that a mother would be so nice to a daughter, because that had not been my experience. And until that moment, I had no idea that it could be any different. And I think that was the first inkling that I ever had, but I still didn't understand it. I still didn't really question it. But it was the first inkling I had that, wow, mothers can be different. This is not the only experience that one can have in life. And the other thing that's important to understand is that until we heal the pain inside of us, we can't heal or forgive and move on. We have to heal this emotional pain, which means we have to understand what has happened, we have to recognize what has happened, we have to know how to heal those scars in order to be able to move on. And once that has happened, then that's when the forgiveness comes. Now, just a note here is that if someone has not experienced deep abuse, trauma, narcissistic behavior from a caregiver or a parent, or they're very unempathetic in general, or they've not healed their own pain, their own abuse, these people are very unlikely to understand or empathize with your situation. And you can share what's gone on for you with these people, and they will rationalize it away, just like we do ourselves. They will also do that, and they will minimize what has happened. So just be aware of that. And of course, the person that is going to do this most often is the narcissistic person themselves, because they cannot face the truth. It's very difficult for them to face the truth. So let's look at what is narcissism. So Narcissus was apparently a handsome, arrogant, and self-involved man who was in love with his own image. He couldn't tear himself away from his reflection in a pool of water, and ultimately his self-love consumed him. And he died gazing at himself in the water, and that is where the word comes from. So some definitions of narcissism: excessive interest in or admiration of oneself and one's physical appearance. In psychology, extreme selfishness with a grandiose view of one's own talents and a craving for admiration as characterizing a personality type. In psychoanalysis, self-centeredness arising from failure to distinguish the self from external objects, either in very young babies or as a feature of a mental disorder. Obviously, that's quite a dry explanation. I'm going to be making it more real and accessible as we go through, but these are just some dictionary definitions. In the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, narcissism is described as a personality disorder which has 9 traits. And each of these 9 traits is exhibited through feelings and behaviors that say, it's all about me and you're not good enough. So I should have highlighted that in bold when I put it in there. It's all about me and you're not good enough. There is a lack of empathy and an inability to show love. The narcissistic person appears to have a superficial emotional life and their world is image orientated, concerned with how things look to others. So there is a continuum, I would say, of narcissism, just like there's a continuum for any emotions. For example, anger, you can have slightly ticked off and annoyed to rage and fury on the other end. There's always a continuum. So we can have somebody who is extremely narcissistic or mildly narcissistic or somewhere in the middle. And only you can know through investigating your own life and reflecting on, well, if you had a narcissistic parent, what end of the spectrum do they sit? And I've worked with clients who have parents who sit on both ends of those spectrum. So let's go through these 9 traits, and you can see and reflect, you know, does my mother, or maybe even my father, but we are focusing on the mother in this webinar, does my mother have any of these traits? So a grandiose sense of self-importance, is preoccupied with fantasies of unlimited success, power, brilliance, beauty, or ideal love, believes that he or she is special and unique and can only be understood by or should associate with other special or high status people or institutions, requires excessive admiration, has a sense of entitlement, in other words, unreasonable expectations of especially favorable treatment or automatic compliance with his or her expectations, is interpersonally exploitative, in other words, they take advantage of others to achieve his or her own needs, lacks empathy, is unwilling to recognize or identify with the feelings and needs of others, is often envious of others or believes that others are envious of her or him, and shows arrogance and haughty behaviors or attitudes. Now, what was really interesting as I was reading these 9 traits was that I could actually see some of this in myself, and not excessively, but I can certainly see some of this in myself, and more so in the past than now. But the reason for that is because I grew up in an environment where this is what I soaked up. This is what I learned. So of course, you know, the sins of the father, we carry on. Unless we recognize and change and stop, we carry on what we have learned and what is programmed into us by the age of 7. So this was quite interesting when I was reading this. And what I recommend you do is that if you see any of these in yourself, don't judge yourself. Don't feel bad, don't put yourself down, just recognize, because once we recognize what is, then we can change it. So what is interesting in the book, You're Not Crazy, It's Your Mother, Understanding and Healing for Daughters of Narcissistic Mothers, Danu Morrigan says there are 2 types of narcissistic mother. She categorizes 2 main types. And one is the ignoring mother, and one is the engulfing mother. So the ignoring mother will abuse, put down, be mean, ignore, neglect. This is the type of behavior that an ignoring narcissistic mother will do. Whereas the engulfing mother will be the smothering mother. They'll just be all over you, just like trying to control everything. You know, how you dress, what you eat, what you do. They just never leave you alone. But behind it all is this narcissistic personality disorder behavior. So I'm going to go through 10 plus clues or signs that you have or have had a narcissistic mother. And firstly, very briefly, I want to look at her behavior. The main point of this webinar is at what's happening for us, our behaviors, our feelings, our thoughts, but just very briefly, just a few things about her behavior. So she's very likely to be mean and cruel and put down verbally, psychologically. So it doesn't matter what you do, it's never good enough. And you could come home, say for example, with a score of A-, and she might say, well, why didn't you get an A? Lots more to that, but in general, you know, lots of put downs. abuse. So there will be psychological, mental, emotional, physical abuse. So that again, it's sort of the meanness and the cruelty, and maybe, you know, physically then also being hit. She may be nice to others, but then horrible to you. And this is very common. And this is why a lot of people can't understand when you say, well, my mother's really horrible. And they go, well, I met her the other day and she was lovely, right? So the narcissistic mother is very, very good at putting on a mask, putting on a face, being lovely to others. And then when you're in their own private, you know, home environment, she will be very, very mean. Now, what's interesting, before I forget to say it, because I don't have a slide for this, is that whatever we experience in the first 7 years of our life, we will recreate it when we grow up. So when I was in my late 20s, I attracted myself through my energy field, because everything is law of attraction according to our energy signature. So I attracted myself into an abusive relationship. So obviously it was with a guy, so not my, you know, my mother's a female, this was a guy, but it doesn't matter. I still attracted myself into an abusive relationship, because unconsciously that was what I expected relationship and love to be, right? Because whatever we grow up with in the first 7 years of life, that is our definition of how life should be. That is our definition of what love is. And so I unconsciously attracted myself into an abusive relationship. And the funny thing was that I remember when he met my mother, he said how wonderful she was. And completely negated, you know, what I'd shared about her. And so just bear in mind that if you grow up with in an environment with abuse and cruelty, then you're very likely to draw to you people that will repeat that until we learn how to break the pattern. So we will have maybe friends who take advantage of us, relationships, partners who treat us badly, maybe even a boss at work who takes advantage of us. So this is going to happen. It's the law of physics, the law of energy. It's going to happen. Anyway, so other behaviors from the narcissistic mother. She will be very devoid of nurturing touch. In fact, I can honestly say I don't ever remember once having any loving, nurturing touch, but I do remember being hit a lot. So they will find it very difficult to be loving and nurturing in a way that we need as a child to feel safe and nurtured and grow up feeling loved. They will often have intrusive or lack of boundaries. So, for example, one of my clients was telling me recently he had quite a pretty severe psychologically affected mother. And she would just come into his room, go into his cupboards, look around, you know, and he'd say to her, don't come into my room, please. This is my private area. She completely ignore his requests. So they can be very intrusive and have a lack of boundaries. They will be very controlling. So either as a neglectful mother, or as the overbearing mother, like we talked about just before, the two types of narcissism, the ignoring or the engulfing. So either way, it can be very controlling, controlling every aspect of your life, your personal life. Even when you've grown up and you've left home, they'll be on the phone 10 times a day, asking you questions, interrogating you. And here's the tricky thing, is that occasionally they can be nice. Occasionally they can be nice, but most of the time they're not. But when they're occasionally nice, that's when we go, oh, okay, well, maybe I was wrong. Maybe they're not that bad after all. I'll give her another chance. Now, this played out when I was in the abusive relationship I was in. So this was before even that I understood that I was in an abusive relationship, because, again, very, very hard to identify and recognize when you're in an abusive relationship if that has been your norm. So I was with this guy who one minute he'd be really nice and the next minute he'd be really mean and nasty, and it was just like Jekyll and Hyde. And every time he was mean and nasty, my gut, and this is where the three brains come in, right, which I talk about a lot, my gut and my heart would say to me, that's not right, that doesn't feel good, it doesn't feel right. But then my head would come in and rationalize away, because this is what the head brain does, tries to protect us. It's a mechanism that's set up very early in life. I'm going to rationalize away other people's unfair behavior. And so my head would come in and go, oh yeah, well, he's just busy, he's really stressed. I would make excuses for his behavior. And then he'd be nice again. I go, yeah, well, it's okay, he's okay, I'll give it another go, I'll keep going. And this went on again, repeat, until one day I found a book. It just popped out at me in the library, and it was called Men Who Hate Women and the Women Who Love Them by Susan Forward, who's also got another book I'm going to recommend later for mother stuff. Anyway, I was reading this book and I opened it, and the chapter I opened it to was a chapter heading called Jekyll and Hiding, and how these people flip-flop between being nice, being nasty. And finally I understood and I recognized, oh my God, this is what's going on for me. This is my life that I'm reading in the pages here. And that was the first step for me to be able to get out of that relationship. Now, getting out of an abusive relationship is not easy. It's very sticky energy. A lot of extricating of energies between two people has to happen. It is not usually a simple process, but it is doable. And the other thing that the narcissistic mother is very likely to do is to deny her behavior. You can speak your truth and say how you feel, and they'll just glibly wave it away or deny it or say that you're mad or it's not true or whatever. There'll be many ways of denying it, but very common because they don't want to acknowledge the truth. All right, because if they had to acknowledge the truth, that would mean they would have to look at themselves. Now, it's interesting because when you see pictures of depicting narcissism, it's very often looking in a mirror, right? And so they don't want to look in the mirror. They don't want to look in the mirror and see the truth about themselves. And ultimately, the reason they don't want to look in the mirror and see the truth about themselves is because they would have to face the pain that they have buried. So we have to remember that these people who are being mean and nasty to us, it's ultimately because they have deep pain inside them which has not been healed. Now, that doesn't excuse their behavior, but it does help us to understand why they're doing it. But we still need to put a stop to it if it is creating a problem for us. If we are unhappy or severely ill as a result of this behavior, then we have to take the reins of control back into our being, and we have to do something about it, because the narcissistic person is very unlikely to make the change. And in fact, when I left this partner, you know, he then rang up and begged me to come back. And I said, okay, well, you need to see a counselor. You need to sort out these issues that you have. And he made promises and said that he would. And then he went to a counsellor and came back after the first session and said, oh, the counsellor has told me I don't have a problem. So the denial continued. And I could quite clearly see, okay, it's time for me to really fully make a complete break here, which I did. And it wasn't easy, but I did. And it was a huge learning and a huge gift, actually. But interestingly enough, even though I really understood the partner situation, it's taken me a lot more time to heal the mother situation. And of course, that is because that is the person that we grew up with for the first few years of our life, and those that trauma goes much deeper. So what I'm going to go into now is signs in you that you can start to recognize in you that may indicate that you have or have had a narcissistic mother. Now, I've mentioned some of these already. So we will minimize or deny or rationalize away her behavior. There will always be a reason why she did that. Now, what's really interesting is it's only in the last 2 weeks myself that I have recognized something that I never saw before. Even though I knew she was mean, I never saw what I'm about to share. So I grew up in a family with my brother who was mentally handicapped, and that was extremely stressful for my mother, and I really completely understand that. It's very, very stressful bringing up an autistic child, and she had very little help, so I fully empathize and understand that. But my whole life I said to myself, well, the reason that my mother was mean to me was because she was really stressed, right? So it's just so common, we rationalize away. So, you know, the reason that she couldn't love me was because she was really, really stressed, and she just couldn't do any better than that. And it's only recently that I've actually recognized, you know what, that's just not a good enough reason. You can be stressed, you can find it difficult to look after a child, absolutely. But to deny the other child any love or nurturing, and to actively be mean and cruel, well, that's not acceptable. That's just not a good enough reason. So until 2 weeks ago, I was fully rationalizing away my mother's behavior as a result of my brother, and that's only part of the truth. So as I said before, children are biologically programmed to believe their parents, and so when we experience something that doesn't feel right, that something is, you know, we're treated badly, even though it doesn't feel right inside of us, in our heart brain and our gut brain, because we just can't believe, or, you know, we can't allow ourselves to believe that our parents would ever treat us like that, we then start creating these stories in our mind and rationalizing away. And by the way, rationalizing is a rational lie, right? We start rationalizing away the behavior. This will create a lot of mental confusion, huge mental confusion. Literally in the brain, our brain is just in such a turmoil, because one part of our brain, which relates to the heart and the gut brains, is saying, well, this doesn't feel right. And then another part of our brain, which relates more to the neocortex, is saying, yeah, but this is what I'm hearing and this is what I'm being told. And this sets up huge confusion in the brain. And what that leads to is self-doubt. We stop trusting ourselves. We stop trusting our heart brain and our gut brain. So a lot of the work that I'm doing with people is that I'm teaching them how to trust themselves again. This is huge. We have to learn to trust ourselves, because once we lose this inner trust, then we also lose trust of other people, or trusting in other people, and we lose trust of trusting in life. And we lose connection with our intuition, which is our inner tutor. We lose connection with our inner wisdom, and we're looking outside for answers all the time. And we're constantly looking outside for direction and guidance and answers. The main place that we have to look for our own guidance is inside. So we have to come back inside and learn how to trust ourselves again. We'll also live in a lot of fear. Now, this will be happening as a child, but it could be when you're 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, right? There will be this ongoing, unwritten fear of, and the voice in the head going, what will my mother say? If I did this, what would my mother say? So a lot of ongoing fear and fearful thoughts inside of us of constantly, even though we may be an adult, worrying what our mother will say or think. So as I'm going through these, you know, if you are suspecting that you grew up in an emotionally neglectful or abusive or narcissistic environment, you can be checking in with yourself, you know, does this apply to me? As I've mentioned, we will have a lot of self-doubt and a lack of trust. I should have put something else there on the slide there. I duplicated that slide. But we will have a lot of self-doubt and lack of self-trust, lack of belief in oneself, which will affect our ability to operate in our life. It will affect our ability to fully succeed in our life, to be successful in all ways, whether it's in work or in a relationship or financially or whatever. We just won't believe that we deserve to succeed. We will also have a lot of guilt. Guilt is a huge one. And I talk about guilt a lot. I've got other videos on guilt and the difference between true guilt and false guilt. But mainly we'll be experiencing what is called false guilt, which means that we're feeling guilty when actually there's no reason to feel guilty. And we will feel guilty for everything. We'll feel guilty for asking for help, for putting ourselves first, for saying no, for meeting our needs, for especially guilt around any conversations with our mother. So this is a huge sign, although it can also be the sign of other things as well. And we will have low self-confidence, low self-esteem, low self-worth, low self-value. Basically, we will not value ourselves or recognize how wonderful we truly are, because we were never told that, right? We were constantly told the opposite. You know, you're stupid or you're bad or whatever it was that was said to you. We just internalize that, and then that becomes our mind chatter, both consciously and unconsciously. And we just basically don't believe that we're a nice, good, worthy, deserving person. And that will again affect what we can achieve in our life. Because if we don't have healthy self-esteem and self-value, we cannot achieve in our life, we cannot succeed, because we will constantly sabotage ourselves. And this has been a big one for me, and I'm still working on it. I've made progress and I've still got a way to go. So this is a big sign. We will also have self-hatred, self-loathing. We will consciously and unconsciously dislike ourselves because we just recreate everything that came our way from this unloving narcissistic mother. We will believe internally that we're just a really horrible person. Now, for example, for me, the way that used to play out, two things, well, many things, but just two things in this regard, is that I would look in the mirror and I honestly thought I looked like a witch, an ugly witch. I thought I was really ugly. And it wasn't until I was in my 40s where I was looking through some pictures of myself in my teens and 20s, and I thought, oh my God, I was so attractive. And I thought I was really ugly. Another thing we will do is, not because that was my face, is that I would look in the mirror and think that I looked fat. And I wasn't. I was sometimes at my slimmest, I looked in the mirror and thought that I looked fat. This was self-hatred, self-loathing coming out psychologically. So people with eating disorders and bulimia, this is what is going on. And this is why there's such a mismatch between the reality of how we look and what we see in the mirror. We just can't see ourselves as beautiful or nice, because deep down we just feel so devoid of worthiness and so undeserving of love. We will also have what I call a lack of self-care. So for example, one of the things that has always been very difficult for me, it's much better now, but I find it very difficult to cook healthy, nurturing meals for myself. Now, the reason for that is that eating and feeding ourselves is very connected with love, right? So when you're born, you go on the breast and you get this warm nourishment from the mother. And through that nourishment of the milk comes the love, literally through the breast, through the heart from the mother. There's this connection. But if we don't get that, and I didn't get that either through other circumstances of the birth experience, but there was no feeling of being able to look after myself in a healthy way with food, which for me meant not that I didn't eat, but that I ate a lot of junk food because there was emotional eating. And also I just found it really, really difficult to cook meals for myself, because in Chinese medicine, the stomach is related to the earth element. The stomach, the spleen, and the pancreas actually all go together, and they are the earth element in the 5 elemental forces of nature, which are inside our body. And the earth element is about Mother Earth and mother and mothering. So eating well and looking after ourselves well through food is very connected to the mother principle. And because I hadn't experienced that mother principle, in fact, I'd experienced almost like the antithesis of this. So, for example, I remember when at meal times, it was very, very common that I found it very difficult to eat fat off meat and certain foods. It would just literally make me gag. And my mother would sit there and force me to eat it. And I'd be sitting there gagging, and then she would send me out into the room next door to finish my meal because she said, I'm not going to sit here and watch you doing that. So for me, food was a very emotionally charged, traumatic experience. And the way that I comforted myself was to go and eat chocolates and crisps, and that was my way of comforting myself with food, but not in a healthy way. So often, if we don't nurture ourselves with food and good meals, this is a sign of this lack of self-care. And also nice clothes. You know, do you dress yourself nicely? And I remember watching Trini and Susanna, that program, that clothes show, and I remember, I don't know which one it was who said it, but she said, love yourself enough to dress well, or something like that. Love yourself enough to dress well. And that really hit home for me, because I used to walk around in track pants and t-shirts until I was about 40. Found it very, very difficult to dress nicely, and I had to make such an effort to start dressing myself better. And something else I was going to say, it's gone now. Oh yes, I know what I was going to say. So part of that came from, I remember as a kid that my grandmother was a great seamstress, and she used to make beautiful clothes which she gave to my mother to give to me, and my mother didn't want me to wear them because they would have been too difficult to wash. And I can understand that, you know, she was stressed with my brother, etc., etc. But instead I would wear the same clothes for a whole week. Now in some countries, you know, that's nothing. You know, if you go to some third world country, they're probably wearing the same clothes for a month or 6 months, right? But for me, what I learned from that is that, you know, it's not okay to take care of myself with how I dress. And so I would only ever dress up nice if it was a special occasion. That was the only time that I could allow myself to dress nice. And that went back to, you know, that if I was a little girl, when I was a little girl and we went to a party, then I was allowed to put my party dress on. But apart from that, no, just really basic clothes, same clothes for a week. So we take these habits and patterns into our adulthood, and we will also find it very difficult, for example, to go and have a massage or go and do something that's very nurturing and special just for us. Feel very, very guilty for, you know, having a manicure or facial or going on holiday or taking the afternoon off or whatever it is. So that's lack of self-care. We will think that there is something inherently wrong with us, a very deep level, feel like I was born wrong, I was born with a defect, there's just something wrong with me. And it won't even, it'll be like 80% unconscious or 90% unconscious and 10% conscious, but there'll just be this general underlying lurking feeling of there is something wrong with me. And that is because we've constantly been told, either, you know, consciously, verbally, or even in unspoken ways, you're not okay. We will also often create a habit of being over-responsible, just feeling over-responsible. I've got to fix things, I've got to look after people. And this comes from as a child, even though we're experiencing this behavior from the parent, we're still wanting their love and approval, because having the love and approval of our parents, and later on in life our friends and our peers, it's so important for a human. These are called human givens, and you can look up the Human Givens Institute. There are certain emotional needs that we have to have met in these first few years of life. We need to feel things like feeling loved, feeling cherished, feeling respected, feeling important. There's a list of needs, and when I work with clients, I take them through this emotional needs audit, so that we can audit how much were your needs met when you were growing up. So what happens is, if we don't have these emotional needs met and we don't feel good enough, then we constantly think that we have to do better and perform better and behave better and do more in order to feel good enough to just be alive. Now, what we learn as we're healing is that we are good enough just being us without doing anything. And the example I like to give is that if you think of your pets, do they have to do anything for you to love them? No, they're just them, right? And we love them. We love them unconditionally. This is how it should be, in theory, for humans as well, is that we love our children without condition. It doesn't mean we love all their behaviors necessarily, but we love them as a person. And this creates this feeling of I'm good enough and I'm worthy. It just naturally creates it. But if we don't think that, and we don't believe it, and we think we're bad and wrong and we don't deserve love and all that sort of stuff, then we get over responsible, and we'll try and fix everything. We will also draw unhealthy people into our life. And I mentioned this earlier when I was talking about the abusive relationship, is that we will often draw people into our life who walk all over us, don't treat us fairly. It could be partners, friends, boss, anybody. And so we have to learn to start trusting that if it doesn't feel good the way somebody treats us, if it doesn't feel good in our heart and our gut brain, and if you haven't yet watched my 3 brain video, go and watch that. It will describe in detail these 3 brains. We have to learn to trust these brains and learn how to put up healthy boundaries and stop unfair treatment. And that is a lot of the work that I do with clients, and I love helping people to learn how to do that. So yeah, just to mention on that topic, I mentioned it before, when we attract unhealthy people into our life, this is the book that I mentioned before, Men Who Hate Women and the Women Who Love Them. And this was a turning point book for me 27 years ago. This was the turning point in me recognizing, oh my God, I'm in an abusive relationship. This is actually what's happening to me. And that was the start of me getting out of that relationship. Just a few more to go. Negative self-talk. We will be very, very hard on ourselves. If we have grown up with somebody being very hard on us, very mean to us, very cruel to us, punishing us, criticizing us, judging us, putting us down, we just internalize all of that. But it becomes automatic. It becomes automatic, and we don't even know that it could be different. So we have to start to become aware of our negative self-talk. And we will also, I spelled that wrong, pessimism, we will also be very pessimistic. So one can either be pessimistic or one can be optimistic. Optimistic is expecting the best outcome. Pessimism is expecting the worst outcome. So we all have what I call WCST, which is worst case scenario thinking. We will just always expect the worst. And from my observation, the reason we do that is it's a mental pattern that is set up to unconsciously protect ourselves from the next bad thing happening. It's like if you just expect the worst, then you can't get any worse than that. So, you know, if something's not going well in our life, rather than thinking that something good could turn around and get better, we continually think the worst is going to happen. And this has been a big pattern for me, and I'm still working on it. We will also very likely, ultimately, if this is not dealt with, we will start creating symptoms. So depression, anxiety, stress, insomnia, pain, fatigue, endocrine issues, metabolism issues, thyroid issues, adrenal issues. The whole immune system and endocrine system starts going out of balance, and then we start getting all the symptoms that go with that. And that will lead to, you know, even more debilitating illnesses, chronic fatigue, glandular fever, post-viral fatigue, ME, fibromyalgia, irritable bowel syndrome, digestive issues, heart palpitations, nervousness. I mean, so many different symptoms. And in 100% of the clients that I've worked with, when we track back from their chronic illness, we find that there is this disempowerment in childhood. There is a lack of nurturing love and support, and there is a disempowerment where they have come to believe erroneously that they cannot be their authentic self. And this is the crux of it, a fear of being our authentic self. We will also fear criticism. We will fear getting into arguments, because it just automatically turns the stress response on in the body. So we'll become very hypersensitive, fear of judgment or criticism, fear of being wrong, because of course we were always being told we're wrong, and then we get oversensitive to that, and then we're afraid to have disagreements. So we'll get into relationships where we're afraid of speaking our truth, afraid of speaking up for ourselves, and then that in turn leads us to be walked all over, unfair treatment, etc. So this is a vicious cycle that we have to break. And that will lead, you know, sometimes to lying. You know, it's like we're a good person, but we're just afraid to speak the truth. So we tell lies, or we tell white lies, and it all comes from fear. We may also feel very, very lonely and isolated, because we were isolated and lonely as a child. And then we grow up and we continue that, and then we feel like nobody understands us and there's nobody to turn to for support. And this is a very scary and lonely place to be. But I would surmise that there are thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people around the world literally in the same place in their mind, thinking that they're alone and nobody understands, and yet there's all these other people feeling the same way. And as I mentioned before, one of the things that we may do is emotional eating, which is to protect ourselves. And the thing with emotional eating is to not beat ourselves up, right? Because what we're trying to do by emotional eating, we're trying to meet an emotional need that wasn't met in childhood, right? So there's a part of us that's actually being really intelligent. It's trying to meet our emotional needs. We're just not doing it in the healthiest of ways. So just to finish off, a few recommendations. If you, as we've gone through this, have recognized some of these things in yourself, and there's maybe some light bulbs going off, we need help and support, right? We need support from friends who understand, and we may need professional support. What I find in general is that if we have these deep-seated patterns of low self-value, low self-belief, allowing people to walk all over us, not knowing how to communicate our feelings, not knowing how to say no, always feeling guilty, all this sort of stuff, we cannot change that without outside help. Very, very difficult. Reading books is a great way to get insight and some suggestions and guidance on how to make these changes. Working with somebody one-on-one like myself is always going to be much quicker and more direct, but I have got a lot of help and a lot of insights from reading books. And ultimately we have to heal the pain that is inside of us and transform our unconscious mind and change these patterns. So here's a few books that I have read recently that I recommend. Will I Ever Be Good Enough by Carol McBride. You're Not Crazy, It's Your Mother by Danu Murugan. Mothers Who Can't Love by Susan Forward. So she was the lady who wrote The Men Who Hate Women and the Women Who Love Them. She's written that book. Mean Mothers by Peg Streep. Toxic Parents, also by Dr. Susan Forward, very prolific writer. And The Emotionally Absent Mother by Jasmine Lee Corey. So I highly recommend Googling some good books on toxic parenting. And overall, what we have to do, we have to cultivate self-worth, self-love, self-value, self-esteem, self-care. We have to consciously create this, and we have to learn to become our own mother. Like, once we get into adulthood, and especially if it's a narcissistic mother, they are not going to change, right? I know, my God, I hoped for years that things could change, and I've now finally come to the realization very recently that I have to let it go. But so we have to become our own best friend and our own mother. That is what we have to do, and surround ourselves with loving, supportive people who understand what's going on for us. So for more information, you can check out more free webinars, excuse me, more free webinars, my monthly membership program, online self-help programs, private coaching, and all that information is on my website, kimknighthealth.com. So I hope this has been helpful. I love sharing really useful, practical information, and I look forward to seeing you in another video.